Well, thanks all of you for braving the weather and joining us tonight. It's a real treat, a thrill to me really to be talking here with James Comey, who is the principal character, I guess you would say, in Deep State. To many, he's a public hero. To President Trump, he is the lead spear carrier in the Deep State, a sinister cabal which is attempting to overthrow legitimate democratically elected government. Now, I've known Jim for some time. I wrote about him in the Martha Stewart insider trading case, in the Scooter Libby lying case, my book Tangled Webs. I think less known is I also have known President Trump for many years. Years ago, I was at the Wall Street Journal covering him he had a brief career as an M&A leverage buyout guy, and he was trying to buy an airline. Anyway, I went to visit him. It was all supposed to be off the record. I was in his office. A woman was shown in by his secretary, and he said, "Oh, come in, come in." And he said to me, "Here's Mrs. I don't remember her name. She was from the Philippines." He said, "She is the richest woman in the world." I thought, wow, I thought Queen Elizabeth was the richest woman in the world, but who knows? So then he turned to her and said, "Mrs. So-and-so, this is James Stewart, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He's the most famous reporter in America." At which point I knew she was not the richest woman in the world. Now, I didn't write a memo about that conversation like you did, but maybe I should.
Live and learn.
Anyway, to get on to more serious subjects, Jim, I thought I'd just start by asking you to remind us, because people are challenging this very idea, why is the FBI quasi-independent? Why does it have a kind of special status in our government?
Because we've learned through hard lessons, especially in the Watergate era, that for its work to have credibility, it has to be both in reality and in perception apart from the political. So when it investigates the political, members of Congress, the executive branch, even up to the president, its work is trusted. And if it's just another part of the political empire of the president, it doesn't have that credibility and it doesn't do what the American people need it to do. And that's the reason that Congress created a symbolic 10-year term for the director of the FBI after Watergate, so that it was cabined. It wasn't 50 years like the first director, but it was longer than any president would serve as a signal that this has to be in the executive branch, but culturally and spiritually in a way, never fully of the executive branch.
Yeah, it really has struck me both recently and in the past in reading about the rise of dictatorships, that when the investigative agency of the government becomes nothing but a tool and a weapon of the chief executive, then there is really no independent rule of law. I mean, Lenin immediately supplanted the state police with his own secret police and every other dictator that I could see.
Yeah, I used to talk to young agents and prosecutors about the blindfold on Lady Justice, that in a way that's sending a message of the importance of you being apart from the political and not peeking out to see whose fortunes will be affected in what way by my decisions, and so I should have the decision be guided by that. In that sense, you have to be blind to interest.
Well, I'm sure that was never more a potent idea than in the last part of your term, where this is one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book. You were investigating both major candidates for the presidency at the same time. That's never happened before, has it? I mean, even one while the election was going on?
Not in my experience. I hope to God it never happens again, but you're right, we had a criminal investigation open where one of the two candidates was, or the presumptive candidate, Secretary Clinton, was the subject of the investigation, and the other, counterintelligence investigation, which always has a criminal aspect, opened on people associated with the other candidate's campaign. Yeah, as you quote my deputy saying to me when we opened the first one, "You know you're totally screwed, right?" And that he was prophetic well beyond what he even could see.
I mean, you foresaw that this was going to be a highly charged investigation and everything surrounding it. Was it, in fact, even more politicized than you had anticipated?
Not the work itself, but the environment around it was as ugly as anything I've experienced in my adult life. And we were on that field trying to do our work. And so I could see the ways in which we were not going to emerge from it without the FBI's reputation being damaged. as you lay out in the book, what I was constantly trying to do was find the least bad alternative to minimize the damage. But when the two sides hate each other and are trying to use you as an instrument to destroy the other, and you're smack dab in the middle of the field with the whistle, you're not going to get out of that game without your reputation being hurt.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about these cases just for a moment, because somewhat to my surprise, the Hillary Clinton email case is not all water under the bridge at this point. I noticed when Trump kicked off his re-election campaign at a rally in Florida, he was trying to go over his accomplishments during his first term, and he was losing the audience. They were like checking their cell phones and starting to drift away. Suddenly he turns to Hillary again, and they started chanting, "Lock her up." He had them again in the palm of his hand. He still periodically says Hillary Clinton should be in jail. I don't know if I really believe him, but he still keeps saying that.
I don't watch the rally, so I haven't seen that. So
probably just as well. So I looked very carefully at the statutes involving that, and I would say to a certainty that President Trump himself has never examined the statutes in the case law here. But putting aside all the legal technicalities, one of the things that really struck me was that a previous Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales, had been investigated for misusing confidential information. And it was a pretty open and shut case. He could have been prosecuted, but he was not, in the discretion of the department. And I was wondering to myself, what would the reaction have been with a precedent like that involving a white Republican male if you had then charged a woman Democratic candidate for president in somewhat similar circumstances? Did that ever occur to you?
Sure, it would have been, in the words of David Margolis, one of the prosecutors I admired most throughout my career, who since died, he said, it would be celebrity hunting. That's all it would have been. It had to be investigated. It was completely legitimate and appropriate that it be investigated in a professional way. But at the end of the day, the case was not there, and that's not a close call. That despite all the efforts to spin it and Republican congressmen to claim that if they were a prosecutor, they would have brought it, nonsense. I look back at 50 years of cases. There was never a case brought on close to these facts. We would have been bringing it just because it was a prominent person.
I mean, I think it is fair to say that there were enough facts. I mean, there was a mishandling of confidential information,
Sure.
As you made clear.
Top secret information.
And if you were an overzealous prosecutor who did want to simply get headlines and make names, yes, you could have brought charges in a case that you would have lost. And I think that would have been an unbelievable disservice, since that would have politicized the campaign, would have put the FBI squarely into tipping the scales in favor of one candidate
Sure.
or another.
We shouldn't be pulling our punches because of politics or fame. We shouldn't be hitting harder or hitting where we wouldn't otherwise hit because the person is famous. Either way is inappropriate. So what we had to do was decide how have similarly situated people been treated in the past and see whether there's a basis for having a case here, and there wasn't.
And yet this almost hysterical, insistence that Hillary Clinton belongs in jail persists in the political dynamic. Do you have any explanation for that?
No, I mean, it's a lie that in a way has become almost like a chant, that people aren't really focusing on the meaning. It's a fun thing in their view to say. And I think there are also people, you've studied people professionally, they have an ability to convince themselves of anything. And so there are a lot of people who talk themselves into the notion that she must go to jail and lost all focus on reality. Yeah, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Before you wrote the book, how did you experience these events? So I know what I was doing during 15 to May 17. What were you doing, and how did you experience it? And why'd you write this book?
Well, I'm mostly a business reporter, but I have been drawn into political situations in the past, including the Whitewater affair. And just for the record, I'm no great friend of Hillary Clinton's, because they didn't like the book that I wrote about Whitewater, even though I didn't find them guilty of any crime. So I have some experience in that. I knew you from the past, and part of the reason I was curious about it is I was frankly puzzled. I didn't really, watching from the outside, understand why you decided. I understood why you decided not to file the or recommend filing of charges. I didn't understand. I remember I was at the gym that morning July 5th, when you came out, and I got off the treadmill to watch the TV because there you were making the announcement, and I was kind of scratching my head saying, wow, this seems very unusual, and I wonder, why you were doing it. That probably would have been maybe a magazine article or something, but then I also remember being in a Midwestern college board meeting when the news broke that you were reopening the investigation. And
October 28th.
October 28th, and I would say that room was about 2/3 middle-of-the-road Republicans, most of whom I felt were not going to be able to vote for Trump. And a cold wind blew through that chamber. I felt the mood change. And the conversations afterwards, people were saying, oh, she always cuts corners. Clintons don't think the law applies to them. They cheated in Whitewater. She covered up the affairs. It just sort of totally changed the mood. And then 6 days later, was it 6, I think,
that's right,
when, to the FBI's immense credit, I think, you did really a Herculean effort to review all those missing emails and decided to say that we're not changing our recommendation. It was astonishing to me, and this is not anything to do with you, but the media did almost nothing with that. I mentioned in my book, I went back and looked that day. The lead story, the day that you announced you were not changing the recommendation, was how somebody at a rally in Nevada had shouted something about a gun, and Secret Service agents had rushed Trump off the stage. It was a completely ephemeral, insignificant event, and yet it led the news. Whereas your decision to reopen the case, the media ran as the lead news story for 7 consecutive days. Anyway, and then when I found out that there was the Russia thing going with Trump, and there hadn't been a peep about that, I wondered, well, how come the Clinton thing was so politicized and not that? So it was, I think, the same relatively simple questions that everybody else had. But I will say, going into it, from the earliest reporting I've done on you, I've always felt, first of all, you are scrupulously honest. I mean, maybe some people would say to a fault, but in many situations, every single thing you have ever told me checked out. So I did believe whatever you said, I believe to be true, and I'm sure could be demonstrably true. And also puzzling was there some kind of motive here? Because Trump has made you out to be the head of the deep state, out to undo him, but the other side says, oh, you elected him. You're the one who got him in office, and you protected him by not letting the news out. So this all was bristling with questions. I'd like to think that deep state answers these questions, and maybe at the end I don't want to give away the ending, but
Now I kind of want you to.
I'll get around to the ending, because I do think there are answers, and there is something consistent about all those positions. But that's what got me interested in all of this, and I started poking around, asking questions.
Can you say a word about the process? How did you put the book together?
The process was very hard because, as you probably well know, I started working on this after you were fired. And the FBI has never been the most, shall I say, loquacious agency in government. But, you could have a dialogue. They would confirm facts. I mean, I had pretty good luck, for example, dealing with FBI personnel when I wrote my book about the doctor who was a serial killer, the Blind Eye book. After you were fired, it just shut down like nothing I've ever seen. And people were very frightened. Nobody wanted to communicate. I didn't know what Signal was. Do you all know what Signal is? It's this texting thing that evaporates the minute you do it. And of the people I did finally get to varying degrees help me with this, we all had to go on Signal because they were so afraid, and understandably, that any text, any email, any record of a phone call, even on their personal phones, would somehow be subject to discovery. So there was tremendous fear about saying what happened. So it took a long time. And then I have to say, there was also one other extraordinary aspect of reporting on this, is after the success of your book, I was on the train one morning, I would take the 6 a.m. to Acela to watch it, which is not my favorite thing. And I was on my way down there to interview a fairly critical source, and his lawyer called me midway and said, "I'm sorry, he changed his mind, he's not going to talk to you." That was the low point of the whole reporting experience. And the next day I found out he had a book deal. And everybody was getting offered book deals. I think they were your agents. They were combing through the ranks of the FBI, dangling much bigger advances than I got for some kind of tell-all. This smallest shred of information seemed to be worth a book. And then one of the conditions of them doing a book is they couldn't talk to anyone until the book came out. Now, I will say, fortunately, some of them came to their senses and decided that writing a book is a lot harder than, especially when the only real information you have is a shred about Trump, and trying to build a whole book out of that is not so easy. So even the person that I was going to see later was very helpful in the book. And I think what overcame the fear, the resistance, was just the ongoing, outrageous publicity campaign attacking the FBI and the Justice Department day in and day out. But I will say one of the somewhat pleasant surprises to me was how many people in the White House ended up helping. And I think one of the things I like about the book is it's not just the FBI's perspective. You do see people inside the FBI also interacting with the president, interacting with people in the FBI. And one of the, I think, surprising things about it was the degree to which even a Corey Lewandowski, who I would not hold up as a champion of the rule of law, even he knew better than to carry out some of Trump's, on their face, outrageously obstructive orders. But it was a tough
Anybody you
job.
really want to talk to you didn't get to talk to?
I would say top of my list would be Rod Rosenstein. And I wanted to ask you about Rod Rosenstein. Rod Rosenstein, as you probably know, was the Deputy Attorney General when Jeff Sessions recused himself, much to the displeasure of President Trump. He became in charge of the Mueller investigation. He was also a participant in Trump's decision to fire you, and he then did call for the appointment of a special counsel, and he was there when the Mueller report was delivered. So he became a pivotal figure in my book. I never did get to talk to him, but I noticed and quoted in the book, I believe it was the day he was named as Deputy Attorney General, somebody said to you, "What do you think of him?" And you said, more or less, "He's a survivor." And he was a survivor. That was a very prescient comment. What led you to say that?
He had served and thrived through, as a political appointee, U.S. Attorney in Baltimore, through different presidential administrations of both parties.
Was he like the longest serving U.S. Attorney?
I think that's right.
So.
And I mentioned David Margolis, who as a joke had on Margolis's wall had pictures of himself with prominent government officials over the decades of his service. And so whenever there was an election where the presidency changed, he would move that party's pictures down so they were easier to see, and he'd move the others up. I don't think
That's
Rod did
telling.
that literally. I mean, Margolis did that to be funny. Rod did that kind of in a more subtle way. That was my sense of him.
Did you know when you were fired, I assume the answer is no, that what his role was in the decision to fire you?
No, and I was really confused because in the envelope that was delivered to the FBI by someone knocking on the FBI's door to deliver it while I was in LA was the president's letter firing me, a document from Jeff Sessions, and then attached to that a memo by Rod Rosenstein criticizing my handling of the Secretary Clinton investigation, which seemed really haphazard, like someone had slapped it together, not significant. And you can criticize in thoughtful ways the decisions I made, but this wasn't thoughtful in any way, and I thought that's bizarre. It's also bizarre that this was on a Tuesday. Last Thursday, the guy had me in his office asking my advice on how to do the job, because I had held his job in the George W. Bush administration. And so over the weekend, he decided that I simply had to be dismissed immediately. So it made no sense, but I didn't understand until much later the details of his role, and still don't fully understand.
Well, one of the troubling aspects of Rosenstein's role in his firing, as you may know, is that he wrote a memo for Trump criticizing your handling of the Clinton email investigation and saying you should be fired for that. But he didn't know the facts of the Clinton email investigation or your thinking process. He hadn't done any independent.
No, it's apparent. And after one of the events he says was utterly inappropriate, that was the July 5th press conference, the guy had me out to speak about leadership to his office. Actually, it was the 27th of October. I spoke to his office, and he introduced me as an inspirational leader. What?
Well, the flip-flopping of Rosenstein is something that you can see in the pages of Deep State, but why he was doing it or what he was thinking remains a mystery that I would love to hear his account if he ever decides to give it, because, you know, he writes the memo, Trump seizes upon that. He uses it as his excuse for firing you. He sends his press minions. There's the famous scene where the press secretary is hiding in the bushes to try to, outside the White House, to avoid getting more questions about this. They insist that, oh, it's because of the Clinton email investigation. Trump then orders Sessions to make Rosenstein give a press conference in which he says he is the one who demanded that you be fired. That, of course, is completely false. Rosenstein at least had the good sense to say no. He refused to do that, which, by the way, angered Trump tremendously. But then he was so sort of unhinged by all of this that in what I think was maybe the most extraordinary week in FBI history, he suggests he will wear a wire and secretly record President Trump to gain evidence of obstruction. And then he says that they should invoke the 25th Amendment and have him removed as being unfit for office. Then, when confronted with this, he comes out and says, no, I never said any of that, even though there were many, many eyewitnesses to those conversations. So suddenly
And he leaves office praising President Trump's commitment to the rule of law.
But there are two mysterious meetings I'd like to ask him about, one-on-one with President Trump. In both cases, everyone thought he was going to be fired. When Trump found out that he had wanted to bring in the 25th Amendment, can you imagine that Trump would actually keep someone who had tried to invoke the 25th Amendment and have him removed? The Justice Department was drafting the press relief that Rosenstein was leaving. Rosenstein went to the White House. Trump, I believe, was out of town. He was in New York that day for the General Assembly, but they spoke on the phone. What was said in that conversation? Nobody knows. But Rosenstein came back. He still had his job. Trump said, oh, we'll discuss it later. Then they get on a plane together. They fly to Florida. That's the key conversation. That's a long conversation. They've never said what was discussed. Rosenstein comes out. He's got his job. Now, I did talk to people who purport to be friends of Rosenstein. And they said, Rosenstein should be viewed as a great public servant because his sole mission was to let Mueller finish his job. And if he had been fired, somebody else would have been given that job, like that guy from Iowa or something, who was just a blatant Trump partisan. And Mueller probably would have been fired. And somebody, again, some toady to Trump, would have been put in to that. So they say the ends justify the means. I wonder what you think of that justification for his various vacillations and his survivorship.
You know, I'm obviously not a fan, but because there's a lot I can't see, I don't want to render a final judgment on the man. I'm deeply concerned by the things he did. I don't know what ends would justify lying about the reason you're firing the FBI director. I don't know what ends would justify for example, his continued participation in the Mueller probe. He was a key witness. I have no idea how he stayed involved in that, but maybe there's a piece I can't see from the outside, so I don't want to render a judgment on him.
I think he also lied about his claim that he didn't, mention the 25th Amendment and that he didn't, or he was only joking, he said, when he said, oh, I'll wear a wire and record the president. It's perfectly clear in context it was not a joke. But again, everyone said, well, he got Mueller to the finish line. But I sort of wonder now, what happened between him and Mueller? I mean, what were the conversations they had along the way? I mean, Rosenstein, as you say, was a key witness in this. He was, I believe, if not the first, was one of the first people to testify in the Mueller probe. But he was Mueller's boss. He could fire Mueller. Trump would have been thrilled if he'd fired him. That seems a very, very awkward, to put it mildly, situation. And then the final result, who won? I mean, what did we get by having Mueller finish this?
Well, I think we got a tremendously professional piece of work, an accounting that is breathtaking in its scope and in its detail for those who choose to read it. So I think Bob Mueller's work was a great service to the country. It was distorted and misused and much less effective than it might have otherwise been, but I still see the work as a net positive. What I'm mystified by is not awkwardness, it's how does a Justice Department official participate in a decision in a case where he's a material witness. I've had that job as Deputy Attorney General, and I can't imagine the ethics official's advice being, yes, I know they're investigating the firing of Director Comey, and you provided a false reason to the president, but you can stay involved in making decisions about that case? It doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe I'm missing something, but it doesn't make any sense. And then to again participate with the Attorney General at the end of the Mueller case, the Mueller investigation, saying, even though Mueller wouldn't make the call, the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General have made the call, there's no criminal case here, it's closed on obstruction of justice. How does one do that when one of the incidents you're closing a criminal case on is a matter in which you're a material witness?
Well, I share that concern, and that's one of the reasons I would like to interview Rosenstein. But again, now that I'm thinking about it, this also may be why he doesn't want to talk about it. There may not be a good answer to these questions.
Yeah, I don't know.
But maybe he'll write his own book, and we'll find out. Let's talk about the Mueller report for a little bit. Like part one, Russia. What did you think about his conclusions there as a prosecutor, as someone, you weren't there when, or you were there when it started, you were removed before he was appointed, but what did you think of that part of the report?
It was very well done and answered questions that I didn't know the answer to by the time I was fired. We knew there was smoke. First of all, we knew two things. There was a massive Russian effort to interfere in our election with different dimensions. And then there was smoke around whether any Americans had participated, had conspired with them as part of that effort. I knew the answer to this. The Russians have done this thing, and I knew a lot about it. This, I don't know. And that's what we were investigating to figure out. And so I wasn't surprised that he got to the end and said there isn't sufficient evidence to charge anyone with conspiring with the Russians. But in the course of that, he laid out a whole lot of evidence that I didn't know at the time I was fired. So I thought it was well done, interesting, and good news that there wasn't a provable conspiracy involving Americans participating in an attack on our democracy.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I've said, who really would want the President of the United States to be some kind of Manchurian candidate or something? I mean, however dramatic and exciting that might seem, it would be a tragedy for this country and I think the democratic system.
And I don't mean to create controversy about what I'm about to say, but that's not a question Bob Mueller answered. That is, the counterintelligence portion of the work that was going on when I was fired was left at the FBI. Bob Mueller took, as his understanding of his remit, criminal only. And so there was no, as I understand it, classified investigation of whether there are links or influences or coercion. Instead, it focused on what provable violations of law are there. And those are two very different things. I don't mean to suggest there is something there, but Bob Mueller was explicit in saying, I'm not answering those kinds of questions.
That is interesting. I don't think most people have focused on that distinction. Well, I want to come back to Russia again, but how about part two, the obstruction, or lack of an obstruction conclusion, the specific statement that I'm not going to reach a conclusion?
I was surprised by that. I think that Bob Mueller was trying to do something consistent with his character, deeply principled.
Because you know him very well.
Yes. There are no photographs of us kissing, but I've known him for a long time and have admired him mostly from afar as a person of principle. And so he was trying to do something principled and fair. As I understand it, it was this, that because the President of the United States, if I accuse him of a crime, can't vindicate himself by insisting upon a trial, because the Department of Justice won't allow us to indict, a sitting president can't have a trial. Given that set of of circumstances, it would be unfair for me to say he committed a crime short of indicting him, because that would leave him unfairly accused, unable to vindicate himself. So I get what he was trying to accomplish. I think in the end, he accomplished the harm he was seeking to avoid. That is, he laid out a very strong case that the president obstructed justice, one the president could not vindicate himself in. And he also engendered tremendous confusion and allowed his work to be misinterpreted and actively sold to the American people by the Attorney General as something that it wasn't. And so I get what he was trying to do, subtle and principled. I haven't talked to him in 3 years, so I don't know what he would do if he had to do over again. I would have wished him to do something different. Either decide I'm not going to investigate the president for obstruction of justice, or lay it out so that this confusion, you're going to get the harm either way, this confusion and misinterpretation and frankly fraud is not possible.
Well, one of the things that troubled me about that particular conclusion or lack of conclusion, and I agree with you, I understand his reasoning, he was clear about that, what he purported to be his reasoning. But the Justice Department policy that you cannot charge a sitting president was in place before Mueller ever took on the assignment. There was nothing new there. So I wondered to myself, had he found explicit evidence that Trump colluded with the Russians and in fact perhaps even initiated their attempts to interfere with the American election, would he have then come back to the American people and said, oh, I'm sorry, I can't reach a conclusion about that because he can't defend himself?
Well, consistent with the logic on the obstruction part, he'd have to. And my guess is, Bob Mueller being the way he is, he would have.
But then it makes me wonder, why did he take the job?
Because I don't know, but I think his understanding of his responsibility, of his remit, was much larger than the president. It was to understand whether there's evidence that any Americans conspired with the Russian effort and any efforts to obstruct that investigation. So I think when Bob Mueller was handed the baton, he saw that the field as much, much wider than just President Trump, and he delivered on that. He untangled and laid out the case of the Russians, intelligence officers, military officers, the social media manipulators. He laid all that out, Manafort, Stone, Gates, lots of other things. So I think he would have taken the job regardless, and I'm guessing he didn't see it as focused only on an investigation of a president who can't be indicted.
I have to say, I remain somewhat puzzled by that. And again,
do you think he failed? Do you think Mueller failed?
I do, yes.
Why?
Because it's there in black and white, as you say. If you read the obstruction counts and you take a list of these are the elements of an obstruction of justice indictment, just check, 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 check. Every single one of those, as I point out in my book, every one of those is in his findings of fact. I don't understand why he says at some point, oh, lawyers would have to spend many days and weeks pondering all of this before they could decide whether to bring charges or not.
Well, I think lawyers would have to untangle the president's role as the head of the executive branch and whether that makes an obstruction case in connection with firing someone like me impossible or too difficult to bring. But when you look at the 10 or so instances of obstruction, there are others that struck me as then a private citizen as much cleaner as a legal matter than that. The direction to a private citizen, the previously mentioned Corey Lewandowski, to deliver a message to the Attorney General to limit the special counsel's investigation doesn't strike me as anywhere near core responsibilities of the President of the United States, and so takes that legal problem away. But part of it I see when I look at Bob Mueller, he and I always had a principled disagreement about the role of the leader of a justice agency in communicating with the public. I always believed that it was your job as the leader of the Justice Department or the FBI to foster, maintain, and encourage the public confidence in your work because it's the bedrock. And to do that, you got to talk to them. And Bob was always much more reticent when it came to those kinds of things and thought he ought to do cases and let the work speak for itself. And I respect that. I think you saw the Bob Mueller that I know in the way in which he approached this and his interaction with the public.
Yeah, I mentioned in the book his nickname was Bob Say Nothing Mueller.
Yeah.
And indeed, he remained true to that. Because you said, who didn't I get to talk to? I did ask to speak to Mueller. He said no. I submitted 3 questions to him. One of them was, why didn't you knew going into it that you couldn't charge a sitting president, so why did you take the mission? He wouldn't address that. I think it was a disservice for him to simply restate over and over again what was in that, and not to see part of his overarching responsibility to help the American people understand his conclusions and what they meant. I mean, again, one of the surprising things I discovered in reporting the book is that when he briefed Rosenstein and Barr on his conclusions and told them he was not going to reach a conclusion about obstruction, they were shocked. They fully expected him to be making some kind of recommendation. And Barr then took that opening and ran with it, which leads me to my next
But
question.
before you move to the
go
next
ahead.
question, so why didn't the Attorney General of the United States, for whom special counsel works, say, not good enough, go back and prepare a recommendation? You work for me, go do that.
Because I think he knew what it would have been.
Yeah.
It wasn't going to be, oh, there's no evidence of obstruction. I think it would have been there as a,
Right, you want it, you got it.
you're going to get it. The other thing about Mueller, I might say, is from what I know about him, again, I don't know him personally, but we've run into this, we've talked about it a little bit. I think Mueller views his reputation for impartiality as very important to him, that he's fair, he's thorough, and he's not ideological, he's not political, he's impartial. And if he had come out and said, the President of the United States should be charged with the crime of obstruction of justice, he is suddenly, again, the spear carrier in an extremely partisan political controversy. I can't imagine Mueller wanting to occupy that role at all. And it may have been that his reputation for impartiality was more important to him than anything else.
I doubt that, though, because I think he is a deeply committed public servant, and if that's where the facts took him, I don't think he would be concerned about his reputation. No one wants to be investigated, but you would want Bob Mueller to investigate you if you were going to be investigated, because he is so fair. And I think that's what he was trying to do here. I think he fell short of accomplishing that goal of fairness because it brought with it so much confusion and the harm. But that's how I think about him, and I don't think he would have pulled his punches.
Yeah, well, maybe he tried to be too fair. I mean, again, this is such an unusual environment. I mean, fairness, I like to think I'm fair. I also like to think I'm impartial. I'm not a political ideologue. I don't think you are either. But when you're confronted with some of the facts, I mean, I have found myself saying things based on the conclusions from my reporting that people would say, oh, you're a partisan, or you're not being impartial. Again, there's somehow the ground has shifted so much that we're talking about things where there was never a partisan divide. I mean, Republicans and Democrats alike pledged fealty to the rule of law. Yep. And suddenly you're in a circumstance where someone may be trying to undermine or discard it. If you're going to take a position on that, you've suddenly seem partial.
But you can't let that epithet of you're now partial cow you into silence.
No, I agree.
The President of the United States stood on a podium in Helsinki next to Vladimir Putin and took sides against his own intelligence community and sided with Vladimir Putin on the question of whether Russia interfered in our election. That's not okay. And none of us who are worried about the integrity of this country, its intelligence judgments, and the rule of law should hesitate to say that's not okay, even if people are going to say, oh, you're a partisan pundit. Rod Rosenstein has called me a partisan pundit. I don't care. We can't be cowed or numbed into silence. Just because the conduct is so outrageous in a way that increases. I don't love this phase of my life, as I've told you, but I would be a coward if I didn't speak out when I know things I can say, I have a perspective, and I have a platform. I want this part of my life to go away, and I'd like it to go away soon.
Bravo, yes.
Which is why I'm an admirer of Jim Mattis as a leader. I don't get his explanation for why he isn't speaking about what he knows. He doesn't have to share confidential classified conversations with the president, but you are a civilian leader who has a perspective that would be useful to the American people. What's the reason you're not sharing that? And so I think there's a danger that we can be provoked. You're exactly right. I find myself, my temperature rising when I see some of these things, when President Trump accuses me of committing treason, and I want to react, but I have to stop and say, is this the appropriate reaction? I need to react, but I can't lose my own personal moorings. Okay, it's a difficult balance sometimes, but you have to speak if you have something useful to say.
Well, let me ask you a moment about Barr here, because first of all, Barr, he grabs the Mueller report. He says Trump is basically exonerated. He says, we're not bringing any charges, end of story. And then the whistleblower comes forward. And the whistleblower report gets handed to Barr, and Barr says, no crime there, end of story. As far as I know, and maybe this is happening, we don't know it, he did not take the whistleblower report, hand it over to Wray at the FBI and say, investigate this and get to the bottom of it, and once we have the facts, then we'll make a decision about whether any crime has been committed here. What is Barr up to in all of this?
I don't know enough to answer on the Ukraine piece, because I can't see enough, and someday I hope we will be able to see exactly who decided what based on what factual record, and so I have to withhold judgment on that. I don't know enough. What he did with Bob Mueller's report is a lasting stain on him, and unfortunately on the Department of Justice I love so much. He used the leadership of that office to fool the American people. He's a very smart man, and if those statements have been made by one of our dumber attorneys general in the past, you could say, well, maybe he didn't understand the report. He knew that collusion is not a legal word, right? He knew that it's no excuse for obstructive conduct, that you were irritated by an investigation, or that you weren't proven to have participated in the underlying conduct. He knows all of that is nonsense, and he said it anyway. That is, I was going to say deeply troubling, beyond deeply troubling. I would hope that our Inspector General, who has inspected me till the cows come home, which is fine, would be looking at that conduct to see if it's consistent with the standards, traditions, and norms of the Department of Justice.
Thank you. We're fast running out of time here, but I want to come back to the original theme, which is the independence of the FBI, the importance of the rule of law in this country. President Trump actually stood in a public forum and said that Article 2 of the Constitution gives him the power and the authority to do anything he wants. I don't know if you saw that statement.
I did.
He's made that public claim. Where are we with the rule of law right now? Who's winning here? I mean, again, when I started the book, I didn't know what the ending would be, but I thought the Mueller report, if it got done, if it was fair, if it reached conclusions we could all have confidence in, it meant the rule of law had prevailed, and that would be a happy ending. That's not the ending I think we got, and we still don't have an ending. Where is the rule of law in this country right now?
I'm able to be optimistic because I don't think we've seen the ending, but at least so far, the winner is our founders. I think the design of our founders is being severely tested. It's a stress test, unlike certainly any in our lifetimes. But so far, their design is working. A key part of it was that the American people handed the control of one half of Congress, one house of Congress, to the opposing party. But I see oversight, I see constraint, I see the courts engaged and moving much more quickly than they used to move to assert their role in this tripartite design of the founders. And so I can't quite see the end of the story, but at least so far, the system is working. That in a way, Donald Trump has provoked, he's weakening the presidency without realizing it. He doesn't think about such things, but he is pushing power, or power is being pulled towards the Congress and towards the courts without him ever intending it to. And the press has been energized and civil society has been energized. I see good things happening as a result of this president's conduct. And I think the main winner so far is the design.
Do you think the impeachment hearings are a good thing?
I do. I was reluctant. I thought the American people ought to render the judgment on Donald Trump. We needed a moment of inflection in this country where people get off the couch and vote the values of this country. And I thought that was critically important. And so in an odd way, I'd said this publicly and people have been confused. I kind of hoped he wasn't impeached after the Mueller stuff. I don't know how, as a member of Congress, you abide your own oath without investigating and voting to impeach. And frankly, given the facts I've seen so far, I have a hard time seeing how a senator could abide their own oath without following through and voting to convict on these facts. It's not going to happen. which will leave the American people the opportunity to again render the judgment, but it's unavoidable impeachment now if you're going to take your own oath seriously.
Well, one of the things, you mentioned the design of the founders, and one of the things that impressed me is we seem to have a Justice Department and an FBI who will not investigate this. So thank goodness we do have a House of Representatives with its own investigative powers who, if nothing else, can let the American people know what the facts are involving the Ukraine and the allegations.
Yeah, and I want to give the media a lot of credit. I really do think this is a golden age of the media. It's confusing and messy, but I think this is an inspiring time for people who want to tell the truth to the American people. And I haven't given up on the fact that there is a truth, it's knowable, and that most of the American people want it.
Well, we definitely agree on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask you about someone else from our past?
Yeah, sure.
You inspired me in early 1987 when you wrote a book called The Prosecutors. I was so fired up after reading that to join the office of Rudolph W. Giuliani, who was then the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, and I did. And some of my friends who worked with me in that office are here tonight. I couldn't see him clearly as a leader as a young, I think I was 26. As a 26-year-old, I saw him very differently once I became a leader myself. Is he the same?
Well, let me tell you one little anecdote from that book. I don't know if you remember this, but some of the young associates, I don't recall you being one of them, but some of the people worked for him, did all the work on these cases. And there had always been a policy that when the press conference was held to announce charges, the U.S. Attorney would be there, but the people, the lawyers in charge, the younger lawyers in charge, would do most of the talking and explain the case, so they knew the facts. Under Giuliani, he adopted a policy where he did all the talking, and he banned them from the stage. It was just Giuliani now bringing every single case. So they complained, and he told them this story. He said, look, in the years to come, no one is going to remember what case you worked on. All they're going to remember is, who did you work for? And so the more famous I am, the better it is for you.
So I can offer a codicil. One of my first press case, Rudy was going to announce. I was a young prosecutor. It was a big stolen car case. And I was told by my supervisor, stand against the back wall. I was actually going to be within the sight of the camera, but don't move. Because the most dangerous place in this city is between Mr. Giuliani and that microphone. And so I have a picture of myself. Ben Ward is there, the former police commissioner of New York, Rudy Giuliani at the microphone, and this giraffe is against the wall, standing still. Not trying to hide in a blue curtain, but standing against the wall.
Well, to answer your question explicitly, my own sense, it may be true of all of us, but as we get older, we just become more of what we were before in most cases. And Giuliani is even more what he was back then, including, I'm sorry to say, many of his worst qualities. Now, my prediction here is he's going to meet with a bad end with Trump, because there is not enough air in the room for both Trump and Giuliani. And one of the most revealing comments in my book, I think, is when Trump greets you and says, oh, here's Mr. Comey. He's more famous than I am. The minute I heard that, I knew, okay, that's the end of Comey. That was your cardinal sin. So, yes, he likes Giuliani getting on Fox News, but have you noticed how quiet Giuliani has been lately? Somebody has gotten a muzzle on him, but I predict a bad end there. Okay, let's turn to some of the questions here. Okay, this is very political. Do you see anyone currently in office or aspiring to get there who you feel can turn the country away from the extreme polarization along party lines?
Yes. It takes, I know some of these people personally because I live in Virginia, but there's two new members of Congress, a woman named Jennifer Wexton and a woman named Abigail Spanberger. They are moderate Democrats who believe in the rule of law, believe in getting together across the aisle to try and solve our problems. And so they are women who flipped districts that have been held by Republicans for decades. They give me hope. They and many, many other, most of them women, those who flip districts, but lots of people like that give me hope. Like you, I travel around the country a lot. I see young people engaging. I was so worried they would pull back. They're stepping forward. They're stepping forward to run for office, to participate. We are going to be okay because of those kind of people.
And there are Republicans who believe in the rule of law, don't you think, and are really appalled? appalled by Trump's behavior?
Sure, privately. I mean, other than Justin Amash, who I'm pretty sure got kicked out of the Republican Party for acting in a principled way about the president's conduct, I think maybe this is one of President Trump's goals. He's accomplishing the moral rot of the Republican Party. And maybe it was underway, but it's being destroyed by this. And so if they think that, take the FBI. They know what the FBI is like. They know we're not a deep state anti-Trump or anti-Clinton cabal, but they sat there and have watched the president and his gang lie about an institution that this country needs and should know that it needs it. But they know the truth. They're just afraid to say it, and that's disgraceful. I don't have a long list of Republicans to offer you.
I think Paul Ryan left. I mean, he didn't speak out, but I think he was offended by.
I think he was offended, but what did he say? He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He knew the truth and left because he found it, the discord, the cognitive dissonance too painful to bear. You could have resolved the cognitive dissonance by speaking the truth publicly. It would have hurt your career.
Right. Okay. Another question here. Is it true that Hillary Clinton deleted 30,000 emails and bleached her hard drive and smashed her cell phone? I think I know the answer to that, but do you want to just answer that part?
No.
Yes.
And here's what it is. I mean, there's important elements of truth in that. Her lawyers reviewed this, what they said, and I believe them, they testified under oath about this, that there were 60,000 emails left from her time as Secretary of State on her personal server. They went through them, concluded about half of them were personal in nature, about half were work. They printed out and produced the 30,000, took the others and deleted them, and then had I think the program was called BleachBit, then had the laptops cleaned with that so that they were gone, they were entirely gone. And that's a judgment I'm sure they regret, but there was no evidence that Secretary Clinton participated in that. In fact, their lawyers did it without her. What was the other part of the question about smashing?
Smashed her cell phone.
Yeah, I don't think she smashed any cell phones.
No, she did not.
But some of her older phones, her assistant, once she switched to a new BlackBerry, would break it up and throw it away.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So she didn't personally do any of this. I also think maybe it's worth mentioning that when all those emails showed up on Huma Abedin's laptop,
Anthony Weiner's laptop.
Anthony Weiner's laptop that she'd placed on there, I believe there was some overlap of the ones that had been deleted by the lawyers.
I don't know that because we don't know what they deleted. Surely there was, because we found hundreds of thousands on the Weiner laptop, but we don't know. This, I think, was a huge tactical and strategic mistake on their part. They could never show what they had deleted to anybody, a court, to investigators, because they had deleted it and then wiped the laptop.
Right. But none of those that were so-called work-related. Anyway, nobody has produced any actual proof that a work-related email was deleted.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. We found lots of work-related emails we had never seen before, but because we don't know what we don't know,
so you don't know if they were part of what was deleted.
We couldn't say that it was in that tranche that they had sorted through.
Well, the rest of the question is, if yes, and of course the answer is not yes, but how can she or anyone else get away with this conduct during a federal investigation?
Right. If we could have proved, and we looked hard at this, that anyone, knowing the evidence was being sought by a grand jury or the investigators, there was a judicial process underway, investigative process, deleted it for the purpose of keeping it from the investigators, we could potentially have charged them with obstruction of justice. We got nowhere near that on showing with Secretary Clinton. There wasn't even any proof that she knew they had sorted them in this way and that they'd been deleted and the laptop wiped. And so there was literally zero chance of making an obstruction case against the secretary on that basis. And it's not worth spending the time on. We looked at lots of other people down below and couldn't make a case.
What do you think Trump's administration is doing well?
I think they've appointed some quality people to U.S. attorney roles. I think I probably hurt the career of the U.S. attorney in Sacramento when I praised him in a public speech there, but a quality career person. And it's almost as if they're just leaving those people alone. There's not the competence to manage them. and to mismanage them, and so there are some quality people. They put some quality people, career prosecutors and defense lawyers on the district court benches, so some of that they've done well. They've called out in a much more aggressive way some of the Chinese misconduct with respect to our intellectual property, and taken a harder line on China's efforts to penetrate our 5G networks. That's something that, without regard to partisanship, the law enforcement and intelligence communities thought had to be done. The Obama administration was reluctant to take a harder line on that, so that's a good thing. It's not a long list, so I'll stop there.
I do think it's heartening, you mentioned the U.S. attorneys, that the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York has brought the charges against the Giuliani Confederates in this Ukraine situation.
Yeah,
and may be investigating Giuliani.
I don't know, but my sense is that he's conducted himself consistent with the traditions of that office.
Right.
He's an alum of that office, and so he's acted like a pro, and that's as it should be. And I've seen a lot of that around the country. I mean, I don't know a lot of U.S. attorneys, but some of them are people who I worked with as U.S. attorneys, have been brought back to government and are quality people, the kind of people you'd want in that job.
Do you identify as a Democrat or a Republican?
No, neither.
You are officially independent, right?
Yep.
You don't even have a registration.
I don't have a registration.
Right.
I'm a person without party affiliation. That's fine.
This is a good question. You are now such a recognizable figure. What's the reaction when you're out on the street?
Yeah, it's weird. It was never one of my career goals to be an unemployed B-list celebrity, but here I am. And because I'm a giraffe, I'm 6'8", people recognize me. And the human brain's ability to recognize faces is extraordinary. And a lot of people come up and say, I know you, man, I know you. And that leads to weird conversations. But in the main, and there's a selection bias at work here, in the main, people who speak to me are really nice. I get the most meaningful conversations I have are the quiet ones that I have over and over again in stores, especially supermarkets. Military people, intelligence community people, or FBI people come up and grab my arm and whisper to me, keep going, keep talking, keep talking. And that means a lot to me. There's been a few haters. Some guy called me a douchebag in Las Vegas. I can actually count them. A woman called me a shithead in the lobby of Yale Law School. She might have thought I was someone else. I don't know, it's Yale Law School. But other than that, not much. And it could be that people stay away who are haters, but I don't think so. I think most of the people in this country believe in the rule of law. They believe in the truth. Whatever their policy interests are, they believe there's something above that that's more important than that. That's my source of hope. And this deep state. In your book, I was so glad you quote that thing I said to you, which I was worried I'd garbled. But I told Jim that there's not a deep state, except in the sense that there's a deep culture in the intelligence community, the military, and the law enforcement community that's about apolitical law enforcement and the truth and the rule of law. They really believe in those things, and no president serves long enough to do lasting damage to that. That's what's deep in this country, and it's our saving grace.
That's right. This is a question for both of us, but maybe you'll go first. What is the most revealing thing you can say about President Trump that we may not know? Well, I'll give an answer. Well, you want me to go first? You know, we've talked a lot about the rule of law, and people tend to think, oh, is Trump trying to undermine the rule of law? Is he hostile to the rule of law? Is he trying to overturn the rule of law? My own sense of dealing with him and the people around him is that he doesn't think in those terms. That's how we all think. I don't think he knows what the rule of law is. I don't think he cares to know what the rule of law is. He has no interest in understanding any more than it does. It is simply occasionally an obstacle that gets in the way of him doing what he wants to do in the moment. I don't know if that's a brilliant insight, but it does change the frame of the discussion. Mine's
related, but maybe slightly different. I talk a lot, especially in university settings, about ethical leadership. And ethical leaders, in my view, are judged not by the decisions. I'm sure people disagree with decisions I've made, but I promise you they were made in the way you'd want them to be made, which is by lifting your eyes and seeking an external framework. What's the Constitution? What are the values? What's the law? What's the right thing to do here? Lifting your eyes. I believe this president has no external framework whatsoever. He has one reference point, and it's right here. What will get me the affirmation that I need in this moment right now? And so I think it's consistent with what you said. He's not looking at these frameworks. He doesn't care. It's about filling this hole. And I'll say something else that seems really nasty, but is true. I have never met an adult with a greater hunger for affirmation than this person. It's extraordinary. And I had dinner with him closer than the two of us are, and so much of the dinner was him wanting to get me to believe him and like him and affirm him. It's extraordinary, but it's real, and it's connected to this, and I think is at the root of what you're talking about.
I will say, after he was elected and I was concerned about his commitment to democratic values, I did do a lot of reading about the rise of various dictators around the world and in world history. And that isn't a quality they had. And I took some optimism from that. He wants to be liked and he wants to win. He wants to be reelected. And I think because of that, and because he looks at every decision through that prism, it curbs any impulse. He's not ideological at all. I don't think he truly believes much of the stuff that he spouts in order to get votes. So he won't do anything truly catastrophic. At least that's what I try to comfort myself.
He's not competent. That is, he doesn't know how to manage the federal government. I mean, Richard Nixon was a scary dude because he had many of the moral failings of our current president, and he knew how to run things. This president has no idea how to run things or build anything. There's no Trumpism, right? Who's the next? Who's his acolytes? Who's going to follow him into office?
Well, apparently Eric.
Heard Don Jr. sold a lot of books, though.
Oh, Don Jr.
Mostly
yes.
in bulk, I'm told.
Yes. This question is, do you have any regrets?
Oh, gosh. In general, you mean?
Well, no, I think in terms of your role as head of the FBI.
Plenty. I mean, the overarching regret is I wish so much that we hadn't been involved. I really do. If I had a magic wand that could change one thing, it would be that we wouldn't have had a role, that the case wouldn't have been brought to us or any of those things.
But you couldn't that couldn't have happened.
No, and so the regrets I have are smaller things that I think I screwed up aspects of that announcement on July the 5th. The way I did it, I wouldn't have, my children told me I Seacrested it, by which they meant you saved the conclusion to the end, you should have delivered the beginning, things like that. I would have chosen a different way to describe Secretary Clinton's conduct. I had to characterize her conduct so the American people would have believed the result was credible. The challenge of that case, as you know as well as anyone, was there's ordinary carelessness, where you leave a document in a Starbucks, and there's criminal conduct, where you know you're doing stuff you shouldn't do. Well, hers wasn't here. It was actually here, because she was talking about top secret stuff on an unclassified email system. And so for the result to have credibility, I believed, and believe it or not, I still believe, I had to explain to the American people, look, it's bad. It just doesn't get to here. So they would say, oh, okay, that makes sense. A lot of people have said you excoriated her, you attacked her. I didn't. I tried to characterize her conduct. If I had it to do over again, I'd have said, this is ordinary sloppiness, this is criminal conduct. She was really sloppy. Because so much of my words got seized upon by people who didn't really care what the truth was, to attack the results and to attack the FBI. And then there's other regrets too, obviously. But not the big ones. I hope people understand I'm not being flip. The decision on October 28th was a nightmare. My general counsel said, there are only two doors and they both lead to hell. And he was right. But I still think we chose the right door.
Well, I do think a critical element of that was the fact that it was, you can't rerun this experiment and see how history would have been different. But if you hadn't announced it, it was going to leak out of the New York Bureau. Stuff was already leaking like
Which would have been the worst of all worlds in some ways. You would have concealed it, and it would have come out.
It would have come out.
Yeah.
It would have come out slightly later, even closer to the election. It would have put you on the defensive. It would have deprived you of the opportunity to finish that work and then make the announcement that you did. I totally agree that you made the right call on that. I don't think there's any I can't believe there's serious disagreement over that. This is a good question. Would you retake your previous position as head of the FBI in a new administration?
That's a real hypo. No one wants me, I assure you. I assure you. Being stuck in the middle, we managed to piss off everyone on the political spectrum. So I think it's a hypothetical. It's not a serious question. I would talk to my wife about it. I think she would not want any part of it.
I think this is going to have to be our last question, but it's a good one too. How long do you think it will take for our country to return to quote unquote normal, or will this be the new normal?
I don't know for sure, but the highest probability bet I would make is that it's going to return to normal very quickly, because there's a hunger to snap back, including among those Republicans who I believe have disgraced themselves by not speaking the truth. People know what's wrong with this administration and want something different. My hope is that the Democrats will offer the American people a candidate who they can embrace and say, this will get us back to normal. I'm optimistic that they will. But I think Donald Trump has woken the sleeping giant in a lot of ways. There are conversations about integrity and truth-telling at dinner tables that were not happening 5 years ago. So there will be a snapback that I think will be stunning to us in a lot of ways. That doesn't mean we're not going to have this very, very difficult and self-isolated portion of our political life. The Trumpism is going to die slowly, but the country as a whole, the vast majority, is going to want to snap back very quickly. What we can't allow happening is people pretending they weren't there. What happened when Joseph McCarthy disappeared overnight, left the scene, in fact, I think he was dead within 12 months, and everybody said, who was there for that? Right? Who enabled him? Who was silent? I think it's really important for this country that we keep the receipts.
Thank you.